Now the judges will introduce themselves.
Good morning. My name is Miriam Memar-Sadeghi. I participated in We the People the first year it was offered on the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. I have devoted most of my career to providing civic education and support to civil society in Iran, where I'm originally from, and I'm a board member of the Center for Civic Education.
Oh, you're muted, Tandy.
Sorry about that. Hi, my name is Tandy McConnell. I spent about 20 years as a professor of history at Columbia College in Columbia, South Carolina. Then a few years ago, I decided to do something more interesting, and I became a high school history teacher. So I'm delighted to be here with you guys. And I've been working with We the People. I calculated about 20 years now. I've lost track of how many times I've done these. And it's been always one of the highlights of my year. So I'm delighted to be here with you guys.
All right, Michael DePiero. I work with the Florida Department of Education. I'm located in Tallahassee, Florida, and I think every group that comes on, I have some kind of connection to college football, and you all are Michigan. I don't know. Well, I do know. You're very near and dear to my heart because Denard Robinson is on the cover of the last NCAA football game out there. He both went to University of Michigan, my favorite game, and went to the high school I taught at. So thank you for those contributions, and I look forward to your contributions to this competition.
Can you all introduce yourselves, please?
Yeah, good morning. We're very excited to be with you today. My name is Abigail Anderson, and I'm a senior at East Kentwood High School.
Good morning. My name is Quinton Proctor. I'm also a senior at East Kentwood High School.
Good morning. My name is Tyler Thompson. I'm a senior at East Kentwood High School, and our coach is Mr. Justin Robbins.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, Unit 1, it's what are the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system? And it's the first question, a quote from Benjamin Rush. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? Please begin.
The term revolutionary refers to a major shift in society or the human endeavor. Revolutionary principles at the founding were an eclectic combination distilled from the lessons of history. While the classically influenced focus on virtue remained, it merged with Enlightenment principles of limited government and consent of the governed to produce a new American experiment in the science of politics.
In the British system, Parliament relied on consent of the king to convene and could be dissolved by the king's order. This grievance is prominent in the Declaration of Independence in the complaint that the king had dissolved representative houses repeatedly and denied representation of the colonists in Parliament.
The seismic change the founders pursued would wrest power from above and lodge it permanently in the people. The framers' more realist perspectives on governance were foreshadowed centuries earlier in The Prince when Machiavelli proffers that citizens should set aside fantasies about rulers then and consider what happens in fact.
Just under a century before the Revolution, William Penn explained in The Frame of Government that governments, like clocks, go from the motion men give them, and as governments are made and moved by men, so by them they are ruined too.
In their first attempts at constitution making, the framers embedded consent of the governed in state constitutions, drawing consent from all men rather than the aristocratic elite. In addition, Section 6 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights strengthened consent of the governed, asserting that citizens cannot be taxed or deprived of their property for public uses without their own consent.
However, left unchecked, consent of the governed can foster tyranny of the majority, and many early state constitutions fell victim to populist pressures. For example, in Federalist 10, Madison explains that Massachusetts had witnessed a rage for paper money and abolition of debts, a wave of populism which culminated in Shays' Rebellion.
To temper the will of the majority, the framers implemented separation of powers, rule of law, and a limited government as cooling mechanisms while preserving consent of the governed. For example, Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution requires legislation from the People's House passed through a senatorial saucer to ensure public sentiment would cool.
However, consent offered by one generation may seem less sacred to the next. Thomas Jefferson wisely predicted the need for constitutional change, saying that laws and institutions must go hand in hand, with the progress of the human mind, and suggesting that constitutions should expire every 19 years.
In addition, Madison explained in Federalist 43 that the Articles of Confederation's amendment process denied sovereignty of the people by asserting that to have required the unanimous ratification of the 13 states would have subjected the essential interests of the whole to the caprice or corruption of a single member.
As a remedy, Article 5 of the Constitution ensured that amendments are proposed by a 2/3 vote in Congress and ratified by 3/4 state legislatures or state conventions. Madison explains in Federalist 43 that the new system would guard against rendering the Constitution too mutable, while ensuring its discovered faults could be addressed.
While amendments can provide overdue and important changes, we also recognize the risk of amending too frequently, as demonstrated by the passage of the 18th Amendment and its repeal by the 21st.
The term res nove, Latin for revolution, translates in English to new things. We believe that while the framers established the priority of self-governance, the revolutionary principle of consent of the governed evolved in new ways in subsequent generations.
Before it became higher law, Article 7 of the Constitution required ratification conventions in the states to secure the Constitution's legitimacy, and Article 5 ensured that people could grant or refuse consent in changes to the higher law in the future.
However, the framers' refined scope of consent of the governed has evolved given the passage of 6 amendments expanding suffrage and legislation like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These developments foster expectations of civic participation and generate controversy over the filibuster, money in politics, and voter suppression tactics as modern burdens on the revolutionary principle of consent.
Thank you for your time. We now welcome any questions you may have.
Great. All right. Tell us what you think about civil disobedience. Is it consistent or inconsistent with your understanding of consent?
Civil disobedience is actually one of the first steps in the right to revolution. It ensures that it doesn't get to the point where we need to revolt against our government, but also leaves room for the people to make the changes that they need.
Yeah, an example of this in the civil rights movement, African American individuals who had faced unjust unfairness by the system used civil obedience in an effort to, and succeeded in changing the government for the better with the passage of civil rights legislation.
We can trace civil disobedience all the way back to Rome, when in De Officii, Cicero mentions that we ought to follow the natural law, and when the common or conventional law goes against the natural law, we can act in relation to the natural law.
Mm-hmm. So the natural law supersedes any kind of human law. As far as protests today in America, do you see, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests as being consistent with pursuing natural rights and giving consent, and do you see any problems?
I do believe that they're consistent with pursuing the right to our natural rights. John Locke actually has a quote that goes, "If governments become more destructive than the state of nature, then we have the right to alter and abolish them." And I believe that this is exactly what's taking place with the Black Lives Matter movement and the progress in altering our police reform. Sorry.
So the Black Lives Matter movement uses their First Amendment rights to protest police brutality in the system today. This is on the earlier end of ladders towards the right of revolution, which is a method to revoke consent. And much like I mentioned earlier with the civil rights movement, this is aimed to alter the government to create change for the better.
And in both scenarios, today with the Black Lives Matter movement and back in the 60s with civil rights, we see a population which feels as though the representation is not heard. So they move on to their First Amendment protections, for example, to protest or speech. And if that gets so far to be ineffective, we may see civil disobedience or an eventual rights revolution.
Okay.
Let me throw a question in there. Are we still in danger of the tyranny of the majority? You said that the framers were concerned about preventing that. Is that still a concern?
I believe that it was a concern, especially during the times of the civil rights movement, during when there was important legislation trying to get passed through the Senate, but the filibuster was stopping it from happening.
Well, that would have been a great example of the tyranny of the minority. A filibuster, of course, protects the rights of the minority from the overwhelming power of the majority. But I think about the tyranny of the majority, is that still something we should be concerned about? Or does the American Constitution adequately protect minorities?
Well, considering that there are movements to either reduce the cloture needed or remove the filibuster entirely, I think personally that there is a risk to the tyranny of the majority. And this is something that the founders were entirely skeptical of. We see in Greece, you have statesmen like Solon, who rises as a demagogue, preaching the abolition of debts, and then uses his power to go against the common good. And you see in Rome, Sulla uses his power to cause an indefinite rule and kill hundreds of people.
The framers were definitely scared of a tyranny of the majority resulting in an executive demagogue figure, as they had just faced under the tyranny of the British rule. They put in place not only the filibuster, the Senate to cool public sentiment, and that was not directly elected by the people, but also the Electoral College, which prevents the tyranny of the majority from electing a president through the Electoral College.
So I'm not referring to any specific events. So it's not Black Lives Matter. It's not pro-gun protests, but in general, to what extent does civil disobedience reflect the consent of the governed across our country? And how should lawmakers look at civil disobedience in their respective areas that may not go with the consent of the people who elected them?
So civil disobedience, again, is one of our main forms of getting our point across to government. So I think that elected officials should be taking people's protests in the streets, for example, very seriously, since we don't necessarily have the power to make legislation. That's the legislative's job. We do have the power to vote them in, but we don't have the power to create the bills. So go ahead.
Adding on to Abby, civil disobedience is a method in which people can put pressure on the government. And through Article 1, Section 2, we have our direct representation at the federal level in the House. So at least policymakers in the House should take these acts into consideration, whereas the Senate may be used as a cooling mechanism to refine those perspectives.
So taking that one step further, with the consent of the governed, how should my local representative, United States representative, look at a protest happening in Wyoming in regard to how my local representative might vote on an issue?
Can you repeat the last part of your question?
Sure. I'm getting at the consent of the governed. So I elected my local representative to represent me and my constituency here. There's a protest in Wyoming. How should our elected official here in Leon County, Florida, vote based on what's going on in Wyoming and protests in Wyoming that may not necessarily reflect the will of the people here in this constituency?
So the House of Representatives was designed to be closer to the constituents. They have smaller districts that reflect more homogenized communities rather than at the federal level. And so if there is a protest in Wyoming, if that is a common theme of infringement of natural rights going elsewhere, then our representatives should take action on the behalf of the whole country. But since they are dealing with local matters, they should be able to, the representatives in Wyoming should be able to rally support for that.
The layers of federalism also help us to deal with localized issues at a more effective level.
Yeah, adding on to Abby, McCulloch v. Maryland establishes that through federalism, we have dual protections of our rights through different layers of government in which we can better homogenize at a geographical location.
Okay,
Time.
thank you. Fantastic. You guys have a lot to be proud of. It's, I have to say, it's nice to see you sitting next to each other. And you worked in unison and as a team. You were very agile. You were able to bring in a lot of content, a lot of material, and a lot of reference points from all over. I can almost see the whiteboard that you may have used and the lines that you connected, used to connect between different concepts from philosophy, from the founding up to the present. There's a lot of moving back and forth that seemed pretty effortless. Pleasure to listen to you.
I very much liked your initial presentation and the discussion that followed, but I thought it was just a very it just followed very logically. You introduced the Enlightenment as that was one of the sources of this idea of consent, and then you move to the Machiavelli's The Prince, William Penn, all the completely in many ways unrelated thinkers, but the idea flows from one to the next to the next. I like the idea that you began with the British idea of a royal consent for the government, and then that's going to not just going to be a radical revolution, but it's going to an evolution into the idea of the consent of the people. That was great, and that was a lot of fun to watch that process happen.
Yep. I liked how with the question about local consents and voting versus what's happening nationally and how local legislatures should vote, I like the approach you took about let's just go back to founding principles. You didn't necessarily go back to founding principles, but you mentioned natural rights. So regardless of what's happening in Wyoming or Michigan, the local legislatures, based on your answer, should look at, hey, how does this fit into our founding principles? And specifically, you said natural rights. And I think that was a very lawyerly, clever way to answer, I think, a loaded question. So thanks.
Okay.
Wonderful. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Wonderful job, team. We would like to congratulate you and commend you on all your hard work in a difficult year. So good job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that concludes our for today. Thank you very much.